Good morning or good afternoon, whichever side of the Indian Ocean you are on. My name is Hugo Seymour, Research Analyst at the Perth US Asia Centre, and I'm privileged to be joined today with a special guest, Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, to talk about the India-Australia economic relationship. Ambassador, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Hugo.
Thank you so much for joining us. Ambassador, just for our international and Australian stakeholders, I'll give you an introduction and then we'll dive into a discussion. So, Ambassador Wadhwa served for nearly 4 decades in the Indian Foreign Service, including postings as ambassador to many nations across the Indo-Pacific as well. And more recent times, in the last couple of years, has been the lead author of the upcoming Australia Economic Strategy document, which, as we know, is the Indian government's equivalent of Australia's India Economic Strategy, with both these two documents designed to chart a path forward for a bilateral economic relationship into the future. Now, Ambassador, we can't ignore the current circumstances and the conditions we find ourselves in. Good to see you safe and well in your home. In both Australia and India, we've been under tight social and economic restrictions since mid-March. Australia is starting to unwind domestically now. Can you please give us an update on the Indian COVID-19 situation and how the Indian economy is faring at the moment?
Thank you for that question, Hugo. Let me start by saying that, like many other countries in the world, India is also into the third phase now of the lockdown, and that is currently on till the 17th of May. As of today, India has exactly 67,187 confirmed cases of COVID-19. With a relatively high recovery rate. In a country as diverse as India, with a population of 1.3 billion people, I think one should not be alarmed at these figures. And actually what's happened is that the government has gradually ramped up testing across the country. It's also beefed up its personal protection gear stocks. And this lockdown has actually helped India in slowing the sharp increase of those affected. So the curve is rising at a much, much lower trajectory. There is more confidence now in the government and health authorities on way in which this pandemic will be controlled in the future. Now, having said all this, India is gradually preparing for a new normal as the economy becomes the center stage of discussion after 47 days of lockdown. So more than unlocking, it is about adapting to the situation and restarting the economy. And today, in fact, the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, is doing a virtual conference with the chief ministers of all the states. And this will be his 5th such meeting since the 20th of March, where he's going to discuss the way ahead in relaxing this nationwide lockdown and also fine-tuning the containment measures that India has taken and how to cope with the reverse migration that we've seen of workers from cities to villages. Now, this is a peculiar phenomena as far as India is concerned. And India's economic growth projections, like many other countries, are already down. And the IMF has projected that India should only grow at 1.9% this year. Some private rating agencies have projections which are even lower. So living with the virus for a while will therefore become a way of life, will be the new normal. India now has been divided into green, orange, and red zones in the third phase of its lockdown. And depending on the zone, there is graded economic activity which is taking place already. But as of 18th May, the expectation is that further relaxation will take place. And the focus will be on reviving growth in medium, small, and micro enterprises, including by provision of loans and debt relief, etc. So industry will have to produce at lessened capacity because transport may not open up completely immediately on the 18th of May. But the government is working on multiple fronts to boost this production in the country. It's also offered production-linked incentive to overseas firms in electronics and drug ingredients and also in medical devices, etc. So the first round of fiscal package to help the migrant workers and also small and medium enterprises and series of steps by the Reserve Bank of India to ensure liquidity and credit in the system was announced quite early. That happened in March and April this year. And now the government is expected to unveil a much awaited second stimulus package starting this week, which is expected to include what we call a credit guarantee scheme to ease fund flows to small businesses and also some cash support for migrant workers. A package for services, one of the worst affected sectors, could follow soon. And the government has already raised its borrowing target for the current year. But India also has to be mindful of worldwide ratings because it would not like to lose out on foreign portfolio investment coming into India. That's come at a very fast clip over the last few years. So there is this risk of sharp deterioration of general government debt from 70% of GDP to potentially 75 to 80% if a massive big bang package is announced. So I suspect, therefore, that India would go in for a series of smaller and targeted sector-wise fiscal aid packages for the affected sectors of the economy. I think that would be my summary of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah, in Australia, over the weekend, we've seen some announcements from the Prime Minister looking to hopefully have most of the economy operating by July, but very cautiously as we approach to that stage. But we're looking to have our international travel restrictions and international people movement limited for the foreseeable future. In Australia, we are at the same time as having a public discussion about the recovery stage. We're also having a discussion and a debate around our future economic and trading relationships, particularly around diversifying our trading partners and our supply chains, and also there are greater calls for the need for Australia to be more self-sufficient in certain critical areas. What's the current stage and debate of the Indian public policy around India's future trade and investment relationships?
Well, Hugo, ironically, India's external trade and exports had just about picked up in February 2020. And that is just before the pandemic struck the world. And so the lack of credit now and fall in oil prices across the world. There's also a reduction in shipping services, and there's disarray at many ports still around the world. So all this has had an impact, as you know, on international trade. And India's total value of trade before the pandemic was around 700 billion, which was about 40% of its GDP. So for a while, India has had a goal of a 5 trillion economy by 2024-25, which will get drastically scaled down post this pandemic. But the thinking will not necessarily change, in my view. So trade policy in India would not merely be for export promotion, but also looking together at the business of exports, imports, and FDI together. So today, 80% of world trade is intra-industry trade, which means that countries simultaneously import and export items belonging to the same industry group. So what countries like India now do is to import an item, they evaluate, and then export a related item. To take an example, a principal trading product today for India is gems and jewelry, and also precious stones, where India imports both diamond and gold and adds value in the form of jewelry and then exports to the world. Now, in the Indian context, it is becoming extremely difficult to separate services exports from commodity exports also. Just to give you an example, India is a leading player in the world market in products which are intensive in the use of IT services. Electronic items are probably the best example of this. India will look at now how can the export of information technology enable services in domestic electronic manufacturing be enhanced so as to export more value-added electronic products. Looking at exports in isolation would therefore become inappropriate. Thirdly, India will continue to manufacture labor-intensive products, but simultaneously try also to move up the export ladder by moving on to the higher value-added technology in intensive products. This requires establishing a position in international value chains. We often call them global value chains. And today, foreign direct investment, therefore, for India has become a mix of technology, commodity, and services. So I feel that India will increasingly associate trade policy with its FDI policy. Overall, one of the major effects of COVID-19 has been the disruption of global supply chains, as we all know. And an outcome of this will be the movement of production closer to markets. India is a large market by itself, and it will now look for lessening dependence on countries like China for APIs, for pharmaceuticals, medical devices and equipment. I think of ancillaries for automotive industry, etc.
Yeah. Well, part of the, turning to the Australia-India relationship, part of the reason why the Australian government commissioned the India economic strategy and then moving on to your equivalent Australia economic strategy was to realise the opportunities that had been opportunities in the bilateral relationship for a long time, but hadn't quite eventuated. We have some significant trade in certain areas that are continuing even right now in metallurgical coal and in IT, etc. We were seeing significant growth in the last few years in the trading relationship, India and Australia, in goods and services and investment. But in the current environment, how's your calculus changed around the India-Australia economic relationship in the short term?
So, look, I've been saying this continuously that Australia is an ideal partner for India in its journey, if we can call it that, to achieve a steady growth rate for its large population, while also facing the challenges that we have of urban development, infrastructure, water scarcity, etc. And Australia possesses abundant natural resources. This is combined with technology, which needs a market, incidentally, like India. And post the COVID-19 outbreak, India is looking to attract companies from United States, Korea, Japan, and Europe who would like to move out of China due to over-dependence. And in this context, India would welcome Australian companies as well. India actually offers very good prospects for labor-intensive industries, and that includes things like electronics, mobile phones, food processing, textiles, leather items, power generation equipment, solar equipment, to name a few. But it would also like to fill the gap in high-tech items by attracting companies in the fields of chips, for instance, lithium-ion batteries for its e-mobility program, solar cells and storage batteries, specialized ships and ferries, so that it can boost its coastal transportation, telecom equipment, and also cold storage technologies and machinery. Then there are innovative industries in which Australia specializes, like water cleaning, waste management, and port automation. So for all this to happen, I believe the thrust will have to come from industry and from business. And I firmly believe that the large businesses in Australia and the Australia Business Council in particular need to be also involved in enhancing this commercial relationship with India, between India and Australia. So India offers an alternative for diversification, and Australian businesses should look at India seriously. Now, having said that, the total bilateral trade and in goods and services between Australia and India currently is around 23 billion US dollars. And more areas, like you mentioned, have been showing an upward trend. And there is promise for much more to come. So COVID-19 has actually brought about disruptions across sectors. And most Indian students actually are facing an uncertain future. And a lot depends on how Australian universities come up with solutions to cope with the situation by getting back to regular courses. And now there's one estimate which says that about 60% of students from India who are preparing to enter universities this year will think very carefully about studying abroad if the pandemic situation does not stabilize by the time that admissions start for the new semester, for the new academic year. So they will need to be convinced of the utility of continuing with their plans. And Australian universities have very good linkages in India. And I'm sure they will come up with some innovative solutions. Overall, I see this situation as a temporary glitch. And once there's some amount of normalcy, the India-Australia bilateral relationship should resume its natural growth path.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very glad to hear that you are optimistic about the future trajectory and the short-term disruption remaining hopefully short-term rather than long-term. Do you have an update, please, for us on the nature of your strategy itself? And we're also hopeful in Australia that with the release of your document, that would also encourage an uptick in, when it's safe to do so, bilateral exchanges, industry delegations, and drive some momentum to restart the relationship again. How are we looking with respect to your strategy?
So Hugo, the Australia economic strategy that I worked upon should have been released before the COVID pandemic. But unfortunately, the visit of your Prime Minister to India, which was slated for January 2020, was delayed because of the bushfires in Australia. Now, this report identifies opportunities for governments and corporates in both countries across the board. It cuts across sectors such as mining, technology and resources, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, education and skilling, in addition to areas such as renewable energy, railways, gems and jewelry, medical technologies and equipment, infrastructure and tourism. And apart from this, this report also focuses on some emerging areas such as labor-intensive services, defense, sports, textiles, digital gaming, automobile components, water management, space collaborations, ferries and shipbuilding, sports and education technologies. All these have, I believe, a definite relevance in the future aspirations of both countries. So in a sense, therefore, the India economic strategy also looked at the long-term horizon. It projects, for instance, that India has the potential to increase its goods and services exports to Australia in a substantial manner, and looks at it till 2035 as well. So I do not see a change, therefore, in the long-term projections in the Australia economic strategy. There will be a short-term impact, especially in areas like tourism and services, education and labor-intensive services, and their related opportunities. And the report is now being suitably modified to reflect this reality. We're actually working on this aspect in the report currently. Now, the report will also suggest mechanisms to take care of precisely such situations, because the government and officials of both sides will need to take a number of facilitative steps, like setting up a coordination mechanism, which will actually be a consultative interministerial approach in order to overcome problems of implementation. They'll also have to enhance allocations and outlay for scientific funds, for education funds, for collaboration. They'll have to facilitate the resolution of issues like double taxation, and also ease the functioning of banking entities, and they'll have to work out easing of phytosanitary and visa-related issues. These are just to name some issues which have been identified in the report. So I believe, situation like this COVID-19 pandemic will also be covered through such mechanisms.
Yeah, good again to hear your optimism that in the midterm we can start to re-engage and hopefully strengthen the relationship. Just finally, Ambassador, insofar as the bilateral relationship, that will of course depend on economic growth and activity and confidence in India and Australia, but also in the region. We are both Indo-Pacific economies and countries. Right now, with regional uncertainty on an economic front and also on the strategic front, how do you see uncertainty in the region impacting the Australia-India relationship on the economic side of the shop?
Well, Hugo, this COVID-19 pandemic is hitting ASEAN and the wider Southeast Asian region as well, in trade and investment and output. That's very important. And I see that tourism and business travel, as well as related industries, especially airlines and hotels, they will be the first to be affected. They already are. And then there are supply disruptions emanating mostly from China. They will reverberate through the value chain in the region. Then there's a negative effects of quarantine arrangements on labor supply. That could also be a very high, depending on duration and the sector. So all in all, I think manufacturing will be hit harder than service industry, where we have telecommuting and other technological aids to limit the fall in productivity. And given time, supply side adjustments will alter trade and investment patterns. The main adjustment, I feel, will involve relocating of certain activities along the supply chain from China to ASEAN countries, for instance. With Japan is already in the works. And although this pandemic will disrupt the relocation pace, which is in a way already happening, as we all know, ASEAN countries can actually benefit from new investments. So I feel that will mitigate the overall negative impact, the short-term negative impact, which will happen now. Now, coming to India, India has had a mixed experience with free trade agreements it signed with ASEAN and other countries because it's not been able to take full advantage of these linkages. And it has also, as you know, dissociated itself from the RCEP agreement, which will bring about a conglomeration of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. That will be one trade grouping because of, we believe, because of insufficient safeguards of rules of origin in particular. Also, a dispute settlement mechanism for anti-dumping. Then there was an issue that we had of base year for tariff reductions. And then the absence of guaranteed services exports under Mode 4, etc., which received no attention whatsoever. So in the absence of these provisions, India, it was felt, would face a trade onslaught from China, and it felt it could lose out in the absence of any safeguards. It remains to be seen now if India would rejoin these negotiations, because there's been a call, as you know, from other partners to do so. But it would be a good idea, in my view, to restart the Australia-India FTA talks to give a boost to the India-Australia economic cooperation. So, short answer to your question is definitely the region will be affected, but I feel adjustments will be made very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, hopefully in areas such as the Australia-India free trade negotiations or RCEP, we can find a way in due course to connect closer together. Look, Ambassador, thank you for such a tremendous download and update on the economic environment and your perspective from India. Here in Australia, we are hopeful that in the near and the midterm we can start to open up our economy again and get business moving again. And in the long term, that simply must involve greater engagement and trade investment with major economies, including yours. So, on that note, Ambassador, I'll let you get back to your good work updating the strategy, and I'll, on behalf of the Centre, thank you very much for your honesty and your warmth. I'll have to, on behalf of my CEO Gordon Flake, invite you to deliver a presentation on the upcoming strategy when it is released, and the Centre will be more than willing to bring you to Perth or have you online to discuss the strategy and the future opportunities for the bilateral relationship. So thank you so much for your time,
Big
Ambassador.
pleasure, Hugo. Thank you so much for talking to me on this.
Thank you.